A fantastic panel that was. Really enjoyed it. And I have read that report and it's fantastic. So I do encourage you all to head to the resource area to download it and dive deeper into those topics for sure. Now, we're going to move into another interesting topic. Now, as we know, as ModelOps continues to be deployed into more organizations than ever, the decision of who looks after these in the process once they're in production must be decided. Is it an entirely new role, or does it form part of the data scientist job description? Now, we really hope you're enjoying our sessions here today, and we're going to dive straight into that. So it's my pleasure to welcome to the virtual stage Corey Jones, who's a senior lead of machine learning engineer of enterprise analytics from Chick-fil-A. Corey, how are you doing?
Doing great. Hopefully y'all can hear me. I have my partner in crime, my son, here with me. So luckily it's bottle time, so you shouldn't hear too much singing from him.
Well, I think your son may in fact be my youngest guest ever, so we'll hit that as a record. But thank you for joining us. Now, probably the easiest place for us to begin is if you could give us a quick 30-second intro into who you are and what you do in your role.
Well, I can try to do it. We'll do it in 29 seconds. Good morning, afternoon, or evening. Corey Jones, as was stated earlier, I work at Chick-fil-A Inc. What I do is I sit between our data scientists and our IT organization. I come with a certain degree of understanding and respect for the statistical underpinnings that goes into data science, as well as the engineering needs in order to productionalize those models. And so I kind of get a chance to play a little bit of analytics translator, one part engineer, one part software solutions architect, and another part just really all around have fun and break things kind of guy. And so that's kind of like my day to day, as well as I think about the overall strategy at Chick-fil-A. So outside of that, I think the biggest thing is father to an amazing son. So yeah.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much. Now, beyond that, set the scene for me to begin this conversation here. In your current organization, are model engineers a new role, or is it an extension of the data science role?
I love that question. For us, it is actually a new role. Um, it's kind of a funny story that went with that because we have been designing and building out a data science organization for quite some time, and it kind of reached that point in time where it was like we needed dedicated resources to think about the end-to-end data science lifecycle from a productionization standpoint. And ergo, about 2.5 years ago, I became the first ML engineer on paper. And since then, we've added some amazing talent to really help kind of further those efforts and build out the underlying infrastructure that we need, to not only protect our models, because again, models are business assets, but we may get into that a little bit later on, but also just ensure that our data scientists are doing what they do best, doing it well, without having to worry about a lot of the things that they don't need to be experts on.
Yeah, for sure. Now, you mentioned there that there was kind of a crossroad where it was a case of, you needing to have this additional role. I wonder if you can give some flavor into what was that point in time. What were the features of that point in time that meant there was this need to scale up and have this additional role?
Oh yeah, so there's some cool stuff right there. You're bringing some of the great questions. Are you sure you're not a reporter? Um, and so some of the reasons why we decided to make this decision, it really stemmed from the fact that we had such amazing data science talent where they were really solving some truly complicated problems. The algorithms, the statistics, all that stuff was great, but then the underlying challenge that we felt at times was really how do we scale all of this out appropriately and effectively. Now, scale isn't just engineering from like a compute standpoint. Scale is making it accessible to the end masses. To ensure that when data scientist A gets a promotion 3 or 4 times, is now director in another part of the business to support that he or she doesn't have to hold the tail on something because of all the things that are associated with that. Anybody here from an engineering or any technical lens will understand technical debt. It will eat you for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Unless you really think about it. And so we begin to think about a lot of those components. That kind of opened the door. The second thing that really opened the door for us was really having we had been working on really modernizing our data operations practice. Was already quite modern. It was more of just kind of making it more accessible, if that makes sense. And as we reached a certain point with that, it was like game, set, and match. Let's do this. And because all those chevrons fell into place, we were good to go.
Yeah, for sure. And I love the additional flavor you've given that. Now, from your perspective, if we think of kind of the audience that are joining us today from a range of industries, size of organizations, etc., And that scale piece is so vital. Do you think this is something that inevitably every organization will be adopting when they hit that kind of critical point? Or do you think in some organizations it will be just the case that it is an additional role for the foreseeable?
I think it really depends. Many organizations, as they begin to identify use cases that make sense for them, and I really want to qualify that, use cases that really make sense and need that type of skill and support, by all means, yes, they're going to start to probably think about we need a model engineer or MLOps engineer, machine learning engineer. There's a whole bunch of terms for this, or just a super software engineer. They'll start to really identify the need to have those dedicated headcount. They help them to focus on and build the core infrastructure, get a lot of tooling and technologies that are needed there. And in this space, I always give a huge kudos to the startup and the startup space and the founders, because there are so many organizations that are really trying to solve pieces of the puzzle. And it's kind of wild to identify what's going to be best. And so for those organizations that reach that type of scale, by all means, yes, they're going to need it. Now, there may be some that they may say, hey, our business model doesn't need anything from an ML AI standpoint. And if there is one single model with an ROI of less than 1% of your revenue, you don't need a whole ModelOps practice. Don't do it. The ROI isn't there, and your CFO, hopefully, and whoever's in leadership would be like, we're not there yet. But when you start seeing higher ROI or perceived ROI all day, it begins to make more sense.
Yeah, for sure. And I actually love that the fact that you've drawn that out as well as a challenge, because I think that is something we've covered extensively on the business of data, is that scale of where you actually are in that maturity and not trying to jump ahead without things actually being ready for that. And it could be very much a case, as you say, that you don't need to be deploying ModelOps if you're not quite there yet for whatever reason. So one thing I do want to ask you about whether so we'll imagine that the audience are at this critical juncture that you were in. What are the sorts of things that you're going to be weighing up other than scalability, in a sense of the additional salaries, who they're going to be reporting into, function structure, whether you're going to have them dispersed amongst the business functions or whether you're going to keep them internally? What are the sorts of things you're going to be thinking through at that critical moment of knowing whether you want to have that additional role or keep it within the data science function?
I think that's an amazing question. This is something I really harp on a lot, is that a lot of times, a lot of organizations, you really got to look at your foundations. One of the biggest foundation components for this, before you can start to really maximize on it, I get it, buddy. Before you can really maximize, is really having a vibrant data operations practice. I mentioned that earlier, but you cannot do model operations if you don't have good data pipelines. If you don't even have any type of modicum of data governance, come on, how many organizations are dealing with GDPR and other types of privacy laws and regulations that are out there? Like that becomes a linchpin. You can't do data science without data. That's number one, really understanding where you stand. The second thing is really thinking about where you are from your data analytics maturity. So we always hear about this maturity. Start talking about, what is it? Descriptive, diagnostic, predictive, prescriptive. If you're not even on the chart, you got to reassess that. You really got to reassess. You don't even have descriptive statistics. So why are you talking about building predictive AI algorithms? It doesn't make any sense. You can't skip steps. Really know who you are, what your organization is doing, and where that foundational aspects are. The third thing I'd say is really important when you're kind of at that linchpin to really assess is organizational structure. I know you alluded to it as well, but sometimes it makes sense to separate your data science team and your model engineering, or your engineering team is going to support them. It depends on your organization and the structure. You have to really know who you are. Don't just say, hey, because Facebook or Chick-fil-A or whomever does it this way, we need to do it that way. Know who you are. In certain cases, it makes sense to combine those organizations, to say they're all under one leader. They handle the engineering and the data science, and they partner with the IT org if they're not in it, so forth and so on. I think that becomes really, really, really important. And that's the sticky stuff. That's the stuff people don't normally talk about with this. They talk about the tooling, the technology, the architecture, but not really the squishy things that can really just, it can stop you in your tracks. And I say probably the last thing really is really to understand the internal knowledge and acumen, or even the desire to dive into this. Not all the time do you need to hire a net new person with some, because the salaries right now for ML engineers are ridiculous. I have people reaching out for me for job offers, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like where did this number come from? not going anywhere, but it just becomes something that I begin to think about and ponder quite a bit. But really to understand, my son, he is tearing this milk up. I got you, buddy. And so that just becomes that. So I think I got distracted mid thought. I'm going to be quiet right now. So if you have a good follow up, hit me. That may help.
Yeah, well, I think that's so true. Just on the point of the salary point there, I think that's so true of the market right now, that it can be just throw a big number at someone and hope, because people are so desperate for that talent as well, because they know that innovation and that kind of transformation can only happen with having the best. So there's a big thing going on in the market in that direction for sure. But I also wanted to pick on something you said there about kind of the big squishy things rather than the tech. Now, I've heard from many thought leaders that they can sometimes experience, and truthfully, most of them have left organizations because of this, is that they experience pressure from executives who have perhaps read an article on AI and they're like, hey, we need to be doing this. They're really excited about it. But they know, and just as you said there, that piece of advice of know yourself, the data leader has looked and said, this is not where we are. We're not here yet. And potentially that executive doesn't want to hear about data governance, data management, and kind of the less sexy things, if we're being honest. So what would your advice be to dealing with that kind of people and cultural challenge when it comes to this wider growth?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that is really the question. I think I have some people who've reached out to me on a couple of Slack communities and asked that same question. So this one gets really sticky. First off, you got to know who you are. If you are that engineer, software engineer, data scientist, or you might just be a business analyst who just sees this and is like, hey, I really need our leadership to understand. My recommendation, first and foremost, is it goes back to what I said earlier. Understand who you are. What is your business stand? What is your data ops practice? What is your data analytics practice? Have all that. That's ammunition for discussion with the upper leadership. A. B. Begin to define what is the perceived or potential ROI. Not necessarily just from a dollars and cents, because sometimes people try to stretch a muscle and that's not their muscle. You could, like as a practitioner, you can really talk about time savings. You can start talking about risk. Like those conversations, guess what? Leadership always wants to understand that. What is the risk of us not doing this well? The risk is in 2 to 3 years, based off of the current growth of data and data science presence within our organization, we're going to hit a really big brick wall. And if we don't activate in the next 6 months or 9 months to begin this, like that conversation, that changes it. It forces leadership to begin to look and reassess and say, okay, let me talk to my people to see how many new data scientists are we hiring? We're hiring 50. How many? Okay, so how many projects do we have? So those questions start to. So I think that you have to kind of also take a grassroots with this, get your information, but then also begin to partner with those in similar or different lines of business that do similar work as you. Like in my experience, one of the things that I found extremely valuable was to begin to partner with business analysts, those men and women who are in the meetings that engineers were not going to be in. But then also partner with those data scientists as well to understand what's really the gap. What are you doing? How much time are you spending? Because now guess what? I can talk about time. We have a vibrant model operations practice. Based off of the current growth of the business, we can reduce the data scientists' waste on data engineering, waste on traditional engineering, and other things by 40 to 50%. As such, that will increase. Like now you're hitting people with some numbers, and you're using your own internal organization's metrics and perspective. So again, it goes back to know who you are.
I love that. Absolutely love that. Now, obviously, we know from an ethical standpoint, it's really important to keep an eye on your model once it's in production, prepared to identify model drift, for example. What are the things that you think we need to be looking out for? If it's a case of we're going to keep it in our data scientist role, or whether it's going to be another role, what are the top things you think that we should be looking out for in our models from an ethical point of view?
Ethics. Listen, that's a whole thing. We got another 6 hours on this. Let's dive in. I think one of the biggest things right there is I always bring up this concept of one of the sexy terms in the space is always talking about the models being biased, therefore causing ethical concerns. I want to challenge that, and I think it becomes equally important to identify the data and see if the data itself was biased before it even hit the model. All the model does is magnify what your data is telling you. And so if you did like collections, so these get some of the data engineering and some of the other things, but it becomes a huge partnership. But you really need to understand where that data come from. How was it gathered? Like asking all of those questions, that helps you from an ethical standpoint, because if my data is already skewed and is already heavily biased, guess what? Ethically, you may be doing something harmful to certain groups of customers, because how the data was gathered may not have been done maliciously upstream, but it just became a fact. And when people start asking a good challenge I like folks to do when you're dealing with data that's been collected internally, ask, how did you sample that data? What is the sample? How did it come from? And so if they say, well, hey, we're talking about what family dynamics or things for like families or babies, and 99% of the people who filled the survey were all men, you and I are going to be like, something's wrong with that. Pretty sure there should be a better distribution between men and women. What were their age ranges? They're all over this age of 70. No, that data's bad. And so I think it really goes, you gotta respect the fact that sometimes the data itself is biased and it's not just the model. The next thing is, as we start looking at these different models and methodologies that are out there from an ethical standpoint, is make sure you have folks, again, if you're a larger organization with a larger footprint with some of the work that you're doing, get a diverse group of men and women to take a look at some of the outputs of your model to begin to make sure that nothing smells wrong. Because, like, and again, it doesn't have to be just a racial thing. We're talking about all paradigms. I want my elders, I want my folks over 60, I want my young professionals under the age of 21 or between 20 and 40. Like, I want a good wide girth of folks. And I think that's when we start talking about I forgot the appropriate term for it. We start doing just understanding the customer, who you're trying to interact with. The third thing I think from an ethically standpoint, and this goes back to just the term ethics itself, do no harm. Ask yourself the question, and look at whatever model this is or a methodology that's being pushed out there. Do you have any concerns putting your name on this? That's the best litmus test at times. Do you have any concerns? If your name was on this model and every time a customer got something from this, and if they had a question, they came to you, would you feel comfortable? If the answer is no, that already tells you something. And then the last thing I'd say is always ask the question. Oh man, two things at once. Always ask the question, just because you can do it, does that mean you should?
Yeah.
And so there's a lot more technical stuff you can get into it, but I think those become high level questions to ask to help make sure that from an ethical standpoint, we're doing right. And if you really want to get super gnarly with it, we got people from around the world here. You start thinking about some of the laws that are in place to kind of protect folks from unethical AI. I think that's the term that's being used right now. Take a look at those laws and see, and then use that also as a litmus test. However, some of that stuff is very deep and very dense. And so, yeah.
Yeah, no, really, really great thoughts there, Corey, for certain. And I do wonder, because I think in reality, having almost like this focus group approach to every model is probably not sustainable for most organizations. But I do wonder whether actually, but when you are in that ability to mature and scale, when you do have those model engineers as a secondary role, you've almost inbuilt that a little bit, that you've at least got a second pair of eyes on the model when it's in production. To quickly make edits to pull it if needs be. I appreciate that in terms of the diversity and inclusion of those teams may not help, but would you say there is an argument that if it's not data scientists themselves looking at the model, there may be a bit less personal bias because you've not kind of made assumptions? It's a bit like if any of us write anything, right, we may not see a typo because we knew what we meant. Whereas someone else would read it and go, hang on, you've made, this glaring error in the first sentence. Do you think there's that element of accountability by having this secondary role?
I agree. I do think there's an element of accountability. It's and I think you really teed it up quite well. Sometimes if you're so close to something, you'll miss things. There'll be blind spots. But if you have a little bit of distance between you and it's something that's somewhat new, you'll be like, oh, have you thought about this? That's why I'm personally a very, very, very big fan of having groups that are like more on the younger professional side, and even depending on what it is, hey, those interns, guess what? They can give you some great perspective. But I agree,
Mm.
not every model can you do that. And I think it becomes more important for customer facing things that make recommendations. People talk about all these recommendation engines. So if you're going to put a recommendation engine out there and it's going to recommend to all men under the age of 25 that you should be spending $600,000 on vehicles a year, I mean, it's biased, and I don't know how many men under the age of 25 can write a check that big. I would have cried at that time. But you start thinking about all these types of things.
Yeah, yeah, for certain. Now, obviously, I mean, the ethics piece is such a big one, and in fact, we've covered it extensively in the festival in the earlier global sessions. There can be a bit of a risk that you tip the scale the other way. I mentioned earlier where you've got that executive who's perhaps really really keen, but then you may have the business that are a bit fearful of deploying models and giving over some level of control because maybe they don't fully understand kind of what is going on there in terms of augmented and automation type analytics as well. So what would you suggest in terms of this kind of umbrella of ethics to give confidence to the business that it's all in hand?
That is the billion-dollar question right there. Every business is going to be different. I mean, there are some executives who are like, listen, y'all go out there and prosper. You're the experts. As long as nothing just smells just crazy out there, go forth and do it. Others going to be like, our brand is too important for anything to
Mm.
happen. I will review, our C-suite will review, everybody will review before we push anything out. So I think that also goes into that business lens. But I think one of the things that we can do as practitioners to give a little bit more and actually a lot more confidence and it may make some people cringe a little bit, but I remember when the EU had pushed out some of their regulations talking about the right to explain, right, for any of the models that you're pushing out there. And I think that becomes really, really important. The question I would bring is, can you explain what you've done and why in layman's terms to somebody who's not an expert in what you're doing? And if the answer is no, your executive team probably isn't going to fly with that. Like if I was a VP and you sent me a slide of all types of mathematics and stuff, and I wasn't a mathematician, and you expected me to understand, decipher, and figure this out, I'm gonna look at you like you're crazy, and I'm gonna ask a lot of questions, and then you're gonna leave there feeling like you failed. When in reality, you had something amazing. You just didn't communicate that in a way, and didn't think about again the right to explain.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Now, one of the questions I've been asking quite a few of thought leaders whilst I've been collecting up content for the festival is kind of your biggest lessons learned, because, and whether that is through successes or through missteps, I think both carry value. So when it comes to what we're talking about today, what would you say are kind of some of the big lessons that you've learned throughout your entire career in this space?
Probably, oh man, there's a lot of lessons. Is there a book for Hard Knocks of all the things that went wrong? I'd probably break it down into three big ones. First off is that don't allow the technology to lead, allow the business need to lead, and then layer the technology on top of it. There's a lot of cool stuff that's out there. That there's oh man, there's so many cool things. This does this saves this time, this has this API, this one doesn't. There's always something new. Don't allow the technology to lead. Um, and so that's number one. Number two, the big lesson I learned is the importance of team. And what I mean by team is having a strong team dynamic in the model operation space specifically, because there's the data scientist. Again, we always talk about those folks. There's the engineer that supports them, and then there's the third leg in the wheel, which I think is just extremely important, and that is your data analyst, the folks who can really do the forensics on that data. He's raising his hand. He has a question, something he wants to bring up. Son, here's a pacifier. And probably the third one I'd say is transparency.
Mm.
Is whenever you're making a decision, whether strategic or whatnot, make sure that you have a communications with the partners that are really going to be there with you throughout the journey. Because the last thing you want is somebody to ask a question on something that you've already decided, or you feel like somebody has decided for you without knowing. And so that transparency, I always lean on the side of over communication outside of under communication, because
Mm.
things can move so fast. And if you allow yourself to get put in a situation where the folks that need to know didn't know because you thought that somebody said something, but then they did, but then you didn't communicate. What happens is you've now put brakes on a project or process that really didn't need them in the first place.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned there about kind of the technology side and I mean, I often refer to it as magpie syndrome, and I know us in the data space, we're very much like, there's like, oh, shiny thing, let's go play with it, right? Because we're curious by nature. How much of what we're speaking about today do you think is a case of one or the other, or it has to be both? So we talk about this maturing and scaling, and you've now got model op engineers taking away from the data scientists. With that, does there then need to be an upgrade of infrastructure, technology, or could it be very much that you've kind of focused on that role and the funding goes into salaries rather than the tech side as well? What's your experience with that level of maturing? Is it concurrent with the role maturing?
I think it's a little bit of both. Definitely is a good mix of both. Because again, you can have a massive salary, and I've spoken with folks who are like this, like, oh, I'm getting paid, but our infrastructure is trash, and I'm dealing with all these issues and all this, and they're trying to get out. And so I think there has to be a good balance between that. The tooling and technology is going to be really important, but you have to have the right people in place to help question it, because they have to question, like, is this the right thing? Why are we doing this? Have you thought about? And so if you get the right people and the right tooling and technology, everybody wins at the end of the day. But if you have amazing tooling and technology, but aren't really getting anybody or the right people in place, nobody can maximize the usage. And then inverse. And so I think it has to be a good balance. But even before you get to that point, again, know the business case, know who you are, A, and then B, I think it's important to have someone to begin to think about what do you need from a tooling and technology standpoint. Some of the solutions architecting comes up, because again, when I say there's a lot of tools and technologies in this space, all data and analytics, it's too much. So you need somebody to help you to try to identify what's going to be best based off of the needs of your business, and then you just make it happen.
Absolutely. Now, I know we've got about 1 minute left here today. So what I'll ask you, Corey, is if you have one piece of advice you'd really love our audience to just take with them from this conversation, because we've spoken about so much here today. What is the one thing you'd love them to bring with them from this session?
The probably the biggest thing I'd bring up, and this is my personal opinion, is that as you think about building these model operations teams, really hone in on that organizational structure. If it does not work well in your organizational structure, or you have pre-existing challenges between your IT org and your data science org, adding a model engineer on an org that doesn't really know how to work well with each other, that will only cause more pain, and you'll probably lose that person. And so my challenge is really hone in on that, because guess what? When you understand where you're going to slot people as best to support the business, that in itself will pay dividends. Because not every engineer has to live in your engineering department. Sometimes they can live in another department with a dotted line to the engineering department. Guess what? Everybody wins, because you get an engineer where they need to be. You get a department that gets the support that they need to, and then you grow from there.
Amazing, Corey. Well, thank you so much to you and your son for such amazing insights today. And unfortunately, we have run out of time for questions, but please, audience members, please do connect with Corey both in the platform via direct message, but also on LinkedIn as well. Now, we are going to be heading to another rewind session here at the festival with a thought leader chatting all about future data fundamentals. We'll see you over there.